Every generation in America believes corruption was worse in the past, until the same hidden pattern quietly destroys them in the present. We grow up trusting that the system has learned from its mistakes, that the crashes, scandals, and bailouts belong to history books, not our future. But behind every boom, behind every promise of prosperity, something old is moving again. Not loudly, not openly, quietly, invisibly. And by the time most people realize what's happening, the damage is already done. Fortunes have shifted, rules have changed. Power has tightened its grip, and once again the public is left asking the same question too late. How did this happen again? What if the biggest financial disasters in America were never random? What if the same hidden structure keeps repeating decade after decade, under different names, different leaders, and different excuses? In this story, you won't just revisit crashes and scandals. You'll travel through the invisible machinery beneath them, the moments of false calm, the silent law changes, the explosion of debt no one questions, the warnings no one wants to hear, the engineered emergencies, the rescues that never seem to rescue the innocent, and the quiet transfer of wealth that follows every collapse like clockwork. By the end, you won't just see what happened before, you'll recognize where we are right now inside the cycle. This is not a story about one corrupt banker, one broken administration, or one stolen election. This is about a pattern that lives inside American institutional finance itself. A pattern that feeds on complexity, hides behind paperwork, and survives by staying just legal enough to avoid prison, and just confusing enough to avoid rebellion. For ordinary people, this pattern doesn't feel like corruption at first. It feels like inflation, like layoffs, like rising rent, like shrinking savings, like working harder for less while being told the economy is strong. It feels like watching retirement plans evaporate while executives receive bonuses for surviving the disaster they helped create. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it reshapes the future of entire generations. This investigation is not about left versus right, it is about up versus down. About how wealth concentrates during chaos, about how rules bend under pressure, about how public pain becomes private profit. And most of all, it is about how a nation can be taught to forget the last collapse just in time to walk blindly into the next one. Before every collapse, there is always a season of comfort. Not safety, not strength, comfort. The kind that dulls instincts and softens suspicion. The kind that convinces people that tomorrow will look exactly like today, only better. This is the illusion of stability. It arrives quietly, wrapped in rising stock markets, cheap credit, expanding jobs, and headlines that whisper the same dangerous phrase again and again. This time is different. People spend more because they feel secure. Governments promise more because tax revenues look strong. Banks lend more because risk seems small. And beneath it all, the system begins to stretch beyond its limits, slowly, invisibly, like a steel cable pulled tighter with each passing year. In every major American financial disaster, this stage appears first. The roaring 20s before the Great Depression, the tech boom before the dot-com crash, the housing dream before 2008. Each time, the public is told that innovation has rewritten the rules, that old dangers no longer apply, that safeguards exist, that experts are in control. And for a while, the illusion feels real. Homes rise in value. Portfolios blossom. Credit flows like water. Even those who were once cautious begin to believe that restraint is outdated. Fear is framed as ignorance, skepticism becomes unpatriotic, and asking hard questions starts to sound like standing in the way of progress. But stability built on debt is not stability at all, it is delay. Every cheap loan is a future obligation disguised as opportunity. Every artificially inflated asset is a promise that someone someday will be left holding the loss. The public does not see this because the costs are postponed. The pain is scheduled for later, and later always belongs to someone else. The illusion works because it offers just enough truth to feel real and just enough lies to stay hidden. The economy appears strong, but only because its weaknesses have been pushed into the shadows. What makes this phase so dangerous is not greed alone, it is trust. Trust in institutions, trust in ratings, trust in regulators. Trust in leaders who assure the public that safeguards are in place. And for a time, even critics begin to doubt themselves. The system looks too large, too confident, too complex to be wrong. But underneath the surface of every boom, pressure is building. Risk is being multiplied, warnings are being filed away, and the same silent question lingers just out of sight. How long can this hold? Because the illusion of stability never breaks suddenly. It cracks in silence first. While the public is distracted by comfort, the real work begins in silence. This is the quiet policy shift, the slow rewriting of rules that almost no one notices until it's too late to reverse. It doesn't arrive with breaking news banners or emergency speeches. It arrives buried in legal language, inside late-night votes, technical amendments, and temporary exemptions that quietly become permanent. To the average citizen, nothing appears to change. Life continues as usual. But underneath the surface, the architecture of the financial system is being re-engineered to favor one side before the next collapse even begins. This is where corruption learns to dress itself as complexity. Lobbyists flood Washington with policy proposals written by the very industries meant to be regulated. Risk caps are softened. Oversight agencies are defunded, understaffed, or legally restrained. Safeguards that once existed to protect the public are reframed as barriers to growth. And slowly, the referee steps off the field while the game continues at full speed. The public is told these changes will stimulate the economy, encourage innovation, or keep America competitive. The truth is simpler and far colder. These changes are preparing the system for extraction. What makes this phase especially dangerous is how boring it looks. There is no drama here, no visible villains. Just pages of legislation no one reads and terms no one fully understands. The average worker is not watching subcommittee hearings. Small business owners are not tracking regulatory footnotes. Families trying to survive paycheck to paycheck do not have time to monitor financial law, and that is precisely why this phase works. Power moves best when no one is looking directly at it. Over time, these small rule changes stack on top of each other. One exemption creates room for risk. One loophole invites abuse. One relaxed standard invites leverage. And what begins as flexibility quietly transforms into vulnerability. The system becomes faster, bigger, more profitable, and more fragile. But on the surface, everything still looks fine. Markets continue to rise. Credit continues to flow. Politicians continue to promise prosperity. And the public, reassured by stability, does not feel the floor weakening beneath their feet. This is the stage where the collapse becomes possible. Not inevitable, but engineered into probability. Because once the rules are bent enough, once the guardrails are low enough, once accountability is light enough, the future no longer depends on if something breaks, only when. And when that moment comes, the public will be told that no one could have seen it coming. But the truth is, by this stage, the damage was already written into law. Once the rules have been softened and the guardrails lowered, the engine of the cycle roars to life. This is the explosion of leverage, the moment when borrowed money stops being a tool and becomes the foundation of the entire system. Debt is no longer just something people use to buy homes or build businesses. It becomes the fuel that drives banks, hedge funds, corporations, and even governments at full speed. Leverage allows small amounts of real money to control massive amounts of risk. And for a while, it feels like magic. Profits multiply faster than logic. Losses disappear behind layers of financial engineering. And everyone convinces themselves that the engine can run forever. Leverage changes behavior in a dangerous way. When institutions are playing with mostly borrowed money, pain is no longer personal. The upside belongs to executives, shareholders, and insiders. The downside can be pushed outward, delayed, or socialized. This is where moral gravity disappears. Decisions become bolder. Bets become larger. Risks that once would have terrified cautious bankers become routine. Complexity explodes, not to protect the system, but to hide how fragile it has become. The public hears words like derivatives, structured products, and innovative instruments, and is told these are signs of progress. What they really are layers of insulation between decision makers and consequences. As leverage expands, the system grows outward and upward at the same time. Asset prices rise because cheap money is everywhere. Stocks go higher not because companies are healthier, but because borrowing is easier. Housing prices climb not because wages are rising, but because mortgages are looser. Governments accumulate debt not because citizens are richer, but because lenders are more aggressive. Everything is connected by borrowed confidence. And the more interconnected it becomes, the more dangerous a single failure will be. What makes this phase especially deceptive is how it rewards everyone at once. Workers feel wealthier because their homes are worth more. Investors feel smarter because their portfolios multiply. Politicians feel successful because growth looks strong on paper. Even skeptical voices begin to soften. Because leverage does not feel like risk at first. It feels like acceleration. But acceleration without brakes is not progress. It is momentum toward impact. And beneath all of this expansion lies the quiet truth few want to say out loud. Leverage does not remove risk, it concentrates it. It compresses years of future losses into a single violent moment. The system begins to resemble a towering structure built on borrowed steel, magnificent on the outside, hollow at the core. And with each passing quarter of easy gains, the distance to the ground below grows farther. By the time anyone seriously questions how high the system has climbed, it is already too tall to come down gently. At this point in the cycle, the alarms begin to sound, but almost no one is allowed to hear them. This is the phase where the system is technically screaming danger, while the public is being told everything is fine. Analysts publish warnings buried on page 12. Economists raise red flags using language so dry and technical that only a handful of professionals understand the urgency. Whistleblowers step forward inside banks and agencies, reporting reckless behavior, fabricated numbers, and risks so large they could shake the entire economy. And one by one, those voices are ignored, sidelined, discredited, or quietly removed. Power does not need to silence everyone. It only needs to make truth inconvenient. Media networks depend on advertising from the same institutions driving the leverage. Politicians rely on donations from the same financial giants rewriting the rules. Regulators plan future careers inside the very industries they are meant to police. So when warnings appear, they arrive into a system structured not to hear them. Instead of investigation, there is reassurance. Instead of caution, there is confidence. Instead of accountability, there is distraction. The public sees minor fluctuations, small market drops, occasional headlines about volatility. They are told not to panic. They are told corrections are healthy. They are told this is all part of a normal business cycle. And because life still feels mostly stable, because paychecks are still coming in, because stores are still open and homes still stand, people accept the explanation. Fear feels premature. Doubt feels irrational. The warning signs do not arrive as an explosion. They arrive as murmurs. Behind closed doors, however, the tone is very different. Emergency meetings quietly increase. Internal models grow darker. Institutions begin subtly positioning themselves for impact. Risk is shifted, disguised, or offloaded. Insurance is bought. Exposure is restructured. The same firms telling the public everything is safe are quietly preparing for what they know is coming. And this is the cruelest part of the cycle. By the time those in power start to truly protect themselves, the public is still being told not to worry. This is where the final trap closes, because once the warnings have been dismissed long enough, once leverage has grown large enough, and once exits have been secured by the insiders, the collapse no longer requires a cause, only a trigger, something small, something ordinary, a shift in rates, a single default, a panic that begins at the edges. And when that happens, the same voices that once whispered caution will suddenly go silent, buried, beneath the roar of the crisis that everyone will be told came out of nowhere. When the crisis finally arrives, it never feels organized. It feels sudden, violent, confusing. One day the system is stable. The next day it is bleeding from everywhere at once. Markets plunge. Credit freezes. Institutions that once boasted of record profits suddenly claim they are days, sometimes hours, away from collapse. Ordinary people wake up to find retirement accounts shrinking, jobs disappearing, and the future they were promised dissolving in real time. The event is framed as a shock, an accident, a perfect storm no one could have predicted. But the truth is, by this stage, the collapse has already been prepared in silence. Fear spreads faster than facts. News cycles turn relentless. Red ticker lines crawl across screens like warning sirens. Words like liquidity, systemic risk, and contagion suddenly dominate public conversation. The crisis is no longer theoretical. It is visceral. It touches savings, homes, healthcare, and careers. People who did everything right begin to fall at the same speed as those who took wild risks. And the most terrifying part is not just the losses, it is the uncertainty. No one knows who will survive. No one knows how deep the damage goes. No one knows who is telling the truth. Behind the scenes, the reality is even darker. Years of leverage unwind in days. The distances created by borrowed money collapse inward like a collapsing star. All the risk that was hidden, delayed, and multiplied now demands payment at once. And suddenly the institutions that insisted they were strong reveal just how fragile they truly are. It becomes clear that they were never standing on solid ground. They were balancing on debt, confidence, and public trust. Emergency language takes over. Leaders step forward with grave expressions and urgent warnings. The public is told the system itself is at risk. That if action is not taken immediately, the damage will be catastrophic. The message is unmistakable. There is no time for debate. No time for investigation. No time for accountability. Only time for rescue. The crisis becomes a weapon of psychology. Fear compresses the public's attention, complexity overwhelms understanding, and consent is extracted not through agreement, but through panic. This is the moment where the illusion fully shatters. People realize that the stability they trusted was never real, that the safeguards they believed in were never secure, that the prosperity they chased was built on a structure designed to fail forward. And as the ground disappears beneath millions of lives at once, the stage is finally set for the most disturbing transformation of the entire cycle, where disaster becomes opportunity and survival becomes profit. In the aftermath of the collapse, rescue arrives, but not in the way the public imagines. This is the phase where emergency becomes policy and fear becomes leverage. Legislatures rush through massive spending packages in days that would normally take years to debate. Central banks unlock limitless liquidity. Trillions of dollars appear with the push of a button. And the narrative is clear and unchallenged. The system must be saved at all costs. But buried beneath the language of national survival is a colder truth. The rescue is not designed to heal the victims first. It is designed to stabilize the institutions that caused the damage. To the public, it sounds compassionate, too big to fail, protecting the economy, saving jobs. But in practice, the river of emergency money flows upward before it ever trickles down. Banks that took reckless risks are restored to health. Corporations that engineered dangerous leverage are kept alive. Executives retain their positions. Shareholders avoid total loss. Meanwhile, workers are told to tighten their belts. Families are told to be patient. Small businesses are told to endure. And entire communities are told that sacrifice is patriotic. This is where injustice becomes formal. Losses that should have remained inside private institutions are transferred into public debt. Risk that should have destroyed bad actors is absorbed by taxpayers who had no role in creating it. The same citizens who already lost jobs, savings, and homes are now told they must also fund the rescue of those who broke the system. And it happens so fast, wrapped in such urgency, that most people don't even realize what they have agreed to until the bill arrives years later in the form of inflation, austerity, and shrinking public services. The emotional damage in this phase is quiet but permanent. Trust fractures. People begin to understand, not intellectually but personally, that accountability is selective, that power is insulated, that punishment only travels downward. The message is clear without ever being spoken. If you are small, you fail alone. If you are powerful, you fail with public protection. And perhaps the darkest part of this stage is that it is sold as generosity. The language of mercy is used to justify the preservation of corruption. The public is told these measures are unfortunate but necessary, that everyone must share the pain. But the sharing is never equal. Because while the public is grieving losses, insiders are quietly positioned for the next phase of the cycle, the phase where rescue money becomes investment capital and disaster becomes the doorway to concentrated wealth. Once the emergency is passed and the panic begins to fade, the most invisible phase of the entire cycle quietly begins. This is the silent wealth extraction. There are no sirens here, no breaking news banners, no public debates, just transactions, transfers, reallocations. While the public is focused on survival, on finding work, catching up on bills, restoring what was lost, capital begins to move with purpose. Assets that were once owned by millions are slowly consolidated into the hands of a few. Homes lost through foreclosure do not vanish, they are purchased in bulk at a discount. Stocks sold in fear do not disappear. They are absorbed by funds with patience and access to cheap rescue capital. Entire industries weakened by crisis are quietly reorganized under new ownership. And because the public is exhausted, because the wounds are still fresh, very few people notice that the ground beneath them is changing again. The economic language begins to shift. Leaders speak of recovery. Headlines celebrate market rebounds. Growth charts reappear on screens. But the recovery does not belong to the same people who suffered the collapse. Wages lag, rents rise, prices climb faster than paychecks. Debt deepens while opportunity shrinks. The economy may be healing on paper, but beneath the numbers, the ownership structure of the nation is being quietly rewritten. This is how crises complete their true function, not just destruction, but transfer. Wealth that once moved horizontally through communities now moves vertically into concentrated towers of finance. The middle class thins. The working class becomes more dependent. The wealthy emerge from the collapse not only intact but expanded. And the public is told that this is simply how the market works, that this is the natural order of recovery, that patience will eventually be rewarded. But patience in this phase is not a strategy, it is a sentence. Because every year that passes after a collapse locks in the new distribution of power. The longer the public waits for conditions to return to normal, the further normal is pulled out of reach. By the time most people realize that the recovery was never designed to include them, the window is already closed. And once the transfer is complete, once ownership has been consolidated and profits stabilized, the system settles again. The chaos fades into memory. The emergency laws become permanent. The new financial giants take their place as guardians of the economy. And with a steady voice and polished confidence, the same institutions that survived the collapse step forward to promise something dangerous once more: stability. Time is the most loyal accomplice corruption has. Once the wealth has shifted and the new order has settled in, the system begins to rely on forgetting. This is the memory reset. Outrage fades faster than consequences. The faces connected to disaster quietly change roles, change titles, change stages. Executives who presided over collapse re-emerge as commentators. Architects of failure return as experts. Political figures who approved rescues speak of hard choices and move on to the next crisis. And slowly, the emotional weight of what happened becomes lighter than the daily pressures of survival. Schools rarely teach the mechanics of these collapses in detail. News cycles replace one scandal with another. Court cases stretch for years until public attention collapses long before verdicts arrive. Settlements are reached without admissions of guilt. Fines are paid as the cost of doing business. And the public, overwhelmed by rent, debt, healthcare, and work, is quietly trained to move forward without closure. Not because justice was served, but because exhaustion is more powerful than anger. This is where the narrative is rewritten. What once felt like betrayal becomes reframed as miscalculation. What once looked like corruption becomes reframed as complexity. The language softens. The edges blur. No one could have predicted it. Mistakes were made. Lessons were learned. And each of those phrases acts like a layer of sediment, burying the raw truth deeper beneath polite distance and technical excuses. A new generation grows up hearing fragments but not patterns. They know a crash happened, but not how it was engineered. They know people suffered, But not why the same people always seem to survive on top. They inherit the emotional consequences without inheriting the structural memory. And without memory, the immune system of a society weakens. The same dangers no longer trigger alarm. The same political promises sound new again. The same financial innovations feel exciting instead of familiar. This forgetting is not accidental. It is maintained through distraction, through entertainment, through endless noise that keeps the past from settling into quiet understanding. Because a population that remembers patterns is harder to exploit than one that only remembers pain. Pain fades. Patterns threaten power. And so the system waits. Not for justice, not for reform. It waits for distance. For enough years to pass that the collapse feels like history instead of warning. For enough faces to change that responsibility feels abstract. And once that distance is achieved, once memory has been softened and scattered, the stage is prepared again. New rules wear old intentions. New optimism replaces old skepticism. And the cycle, patient and rehearsed, prepares to breathe in once more. By the time the memory has faded and the warnings have softened into background noise, the final deception takes hold. This is the reboot. It never announces itself as repetition. It arrives disguised as progress, new technology, new markets, new financial products, new political slogans promising reform, fairness, and a fresh start. The public is told that this era is different from the last one. Smarter, faster, safer, and because the pain of the previous collapse has dulled with time, many people want to believe it. The system rebuilds itself using new language but old incentives. Risk is once again described as opportunity. Debt is once again framed as growth. Oversight is once again labeled as restriction. And slowly, the same behaviors return, not as crimes, but as business models. Leverage begins to climb again. Speculation returns under updated branding. Complex financial instruments reappear with sleek names designed to sound advanced rather than dangerous. The surface is new. The skeleton is the same. A younger workforce enters the economy with no personal memory of the last collapse. They are told stories of innovation, not of manipulation. They are encouraged to invest, to borrow, to stretch, to chase returns in systems they never helped design. And just like before, early gains convince them that caution is outdated, that skeptics are simply bitter, that wealth, this time, will be different. Meanwhile, the institutions that survived the last cycle are no longer wounded. They are larger, more concentrated, more politically connected. They operate with the advantage of experience, knowing exactly how panic unfolds, how rescues are structured, and where the exits are located. They do not fear the next crisis the way the public fears it. They prepare for it, they plan around it, and some quietly depend on it. This is the most dangerous moment in the entire pattern because it feels like recovery. The economy appears to be moving forward again. Markets stabilize, confidence returns, homes rise in value, credit flows, and once again, the illusion of stability spreads across the population like anesthesia. The public begins to exhale. The pressure feels gone. The storm feels over. But the truth is far colder. The storm was only the middle of the cycle. The beginning has already restarted. The rules have been softened again. The leverage is building again. The warnings are already being dismissed again. And somewhere beneath the optimism, the same invisible machine is turning quietly, preparing to convert the next wave of trust into the next wave of loss. The pattern does not repeat because people are evil. It repeats because the structure rewards those who exploit it and punishes those who question it. And once the cycle reboots, it no longer asks whether another collapse will happen. It only begins counting down to when. And here is the moment where everything clicks into place. What once looked like chaos now reveals its shape. Stability was never stability. It was staging. The quiet policy shifts were never technical necessities. They were permissions. Leverage was never innovation. It was a multiplier designed to magnify extraction. The ignored warnings were never failures of intelligence. They were failures of incentive. The crisis was never an accident. It was a pressure release. The rescue was never about salvation. It was about preservation of power. The recovery was never shared. It was harvested. And the forgetting was never natural. It was maintained. This is the hidden pattern repeating in America. Not scandal to scandal, not crash to crash, but phase to phase. A financial machine engineered to convert public trust into private dominance over and over again, under different branding and different leaders, while always protecting the same tier at the top. The pattern survives because no single moment looks like total corruption. Each stage feels justifiable when viewed alone. Growth looks positive, deregulation looks efficient, leverage looks profitable. Rescue looks compassionate, recovery looks hopeful. Only when all the stages are seen together does the truth finally become impossible to ignore. The real deception is that Americans are taught to debate the personalities while the structure escapes scrutiny. One administration replaces another. One party blames the other. One CEO becomes a villain while the system quietly manufactures a replacement. The public fights over faces while the machine continues uninterrupted. This is why the anger never lands where it could actually change anything. It is constantly redirected sideways while power moves vertically. And here is the most disturbing truth beneath it all. The system does not require secret meetings in dark rooms to function. It runs on incentives so perfectly aligned with greed and fear that corruption becomes automatic. You don't need a conspiracy when the rules themselves reward recklessness, protect scale, and socialize failure downward. The pattern repeats not because people forgot what happened. It repeats because forgetting is built into survival. The public is forced to move on. The institutions are paid to continue. This is the moment where the illusion finally cracks completely. The economy you were told was natural is revealed as engineered. The crises you were told were unpredictable are revealed as mathematically scheduled. The rescues you were told were generous are revealed as transactional, and the recovery you were told was shared is revealed as selective. Once you see this pattern, you can never unsee it, because you begin to recognize the early stages forming again in real time, the familiar language, the familiar policies, the familiar dismissal of warnings, the familiar surge of leverage wrapped in optimism, and the most terrifying realization of all settles in quietly. The pattern does not repeat because it hasn't been stopped. It repeats because it works. Now step back and look at what this pattern truly leaves behind. Not just market crashes and shifting numbers on a screen, but altered lives. Children who grow up watching their parents lose everything they spent decades building. Workers who do everything right and still fall behind. Retirees who discover that security was an illusion sold to them just long enough to be taken away. Every cycle reshapes the emotional map of a nation. Trust erodes. Cynicism hardens. Hope becomes cautious. And slowly, people begin to expect less from the system that once promised them everything. The greatest damage of this pattern is not only financial, it is psychological. It teaches the public that disaster is normal, that bailouts are inevitable, that inequality is unavoidable, that questioning power is pointless. It conditions people to survive instead of demand, to cope instead of confront. And while citizens adapt to smaller futures, the structure that engineered those losses grows stronger with every cycle it survives. What makes this story so dangerous is not that corruption exists. It is that corruption has learned how to look like policy, how to hide inside procedure, how to wear the language of responsibility while quietly abandoning responsibility altogether. The pattern no longer needs villains with evil intent. It only needs continuity, momentum, and public exhaustion. And yet recognition changes everything. Because the moment the public stops seeing crises as isolated accidents and starts seeing them as connected stages, the narrative collapses. The moment people realize they are not unlucky, but strategically exposed, the emotional balance shifts, the questions sharpen, the excuses weaken. The machine depends on confusion to survive. Clarity is its only real threat. This story is not meant to leave you hopeless. It is meant to leave you awake, because the pattern only endures as long as it remains unnamed. In the end, this was never just a story about money. It was a story about memory, about power, and about how quietly a nation can be guided into repeating the same trap while believing it is moving forward. The pattern doesn't announce itself with sirens. It whispers through policy, through optimism, through carefully managed forgetting. And long after the headlines fade, the structure remains, waiting patiently for the next generation to trust it again. If you want to keep seeing what others would rather keep hidden, stay with this investigation. Subscribe to Corruption Rewind, because this pattern doesn't end with one story, and neither does our work. Share this with someone who still believes the next crash will be different. And in the comments, tell us where you recognize this pattern forming right now, because the more clearly we see it together, the harder it becomes to hide again.